When asked by a student what he was thinking on 9/11, President Bush gave this answer.
How did you feel when you heard about the terrorist attack?
Well, thank you, Jordan. Well, Jordan, you're not going to believe what state I was in when I heard about the terrorist attack. I was in Florida. And my chief of staff, Andy Card, well, actually, I was in a classroom talking about a reading program that works. And was sitting outside the classroom waiting to go in, and I saw an airplane hit the tower of a TV. You know, the TV was obviously on. I used to fly myself, and I said, well, there's one terrible pilot. And it said it must have been a horrible accident. But I was whisked off there. I didn't have much time to think about it.
This, of course, is impossible. The only footage of the first plane hitting Tower 1 in the immediate aftermath of the attacks came from the Naudet brothers, who were filming a documentary about New York firefighters that day. Their footage was not being broadcast live, and was not aired on television until much later. President Bush's story, then, is likely completely made up, designed to make him look like a decisive leader who was kept up to the minute on what was happening, and continually assessing the information he was presented with. If this is indeed a lie, then what is the truth about what Bush was thinking on 9/11? Was he at this point contemplating the fact that his life was in very real danger? Consider that as the second plane hits the World Trade Center, and Bush is told America is under attack, his Secret Service detail do absolutely nothing to remove him from this unsecured public location, despite the fact that his itinerary had been publicly available in advance. He was a sitting duck, and yet he was allowed to stay there for 20 minutes before leaving aboard Air Force One. What was his Secret Service detail thinking? What caused them to disregard all of their own protocols and all of their training? This is the very situation that they had been training for all of their career, yet they leave the president here in this public, undefended location. Contrast this with Vice President Cheney, who as soon as the attack started was physically picked up and carried to the Presidential Emergency Operations Center by his Secret Service detail.
A call to the traveling president, urgent conversations with top aides, and then a burst through the door.
My agent all of a sudden materialized beside me and said, "Sir, we have to leave now." And he grabbed me and propelled me out of my office and down the hall into the underground shelter in the White House.
Perhaps if Bush was thinking clearly at this point, he'd be remembering how Kennedy was also stripped of his Secret Service protection right before he was killed. Or perhaps he was thinking of the strange early morning visit he had received at the Colony Beach and Tennis Resort in Longboat Key, Florida, where he had been staying the previous evening. The Longboat Observer noted that on the morning of September 11th, at 6 a.m., a van occupied by Middle Eastern men pulled up to the resort and asked to speak to a Secret Service agent by name, claiming to have an appointment for a poolside interview with the president. As no such interview was on the president's itinerary, the men were turned away. This came just 2 days after the assassination of General Ahmad Shah Massoud, the leader of Afghanistan's Northern Alliance, by a pair of Al-Qaeda agents posing as Moroccan journalists, who had hidden an explosive in their camera, which detonated during the interview, thus killing Massoud. Was this van full of Middle Eastern men at the Longboat Key Resort planning something similar with President Bush? Was this another indication that the president's life was in danger that morning? Regardless of whether or not President Bush was aware of these threats to his life that morning, he was about to be made aware of one very specific threat concerning Air Force One. This threat was taken quite seriously at the time, because as researcher Webster Tarpley notes, it was preceded by some very important code words.
And then above all, the centerpiece of 9/11, I think the single most important piece of evidence in the entire day, the incoming threat given to the Secret Service, Angel is next, meaning we will destroy Air Force One. And it doesn't just come with Angel is next, it then comes with a train of cosmic level code words, top secret code words, indicating that behind that threat is a network that has access to the most important secrets of a whole range of executive departments, presumably CIA, National Security Agency, Pentagon, FBI, Justice, Treasury even, the whole array. And that's a threat. The idea is, what they're saying to Bush is, you've got to go on television and start saying, Bin Laden, Bin Laden, Bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, 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 and you will remain in office. If you don't, you may be liquidated at any time. You may not see the end of this day. So the invisible government had to have the possibility of nuclear escalation, and they did. They had it in two ways that we know of. One is that in the Angel is Next phone call, they had code words that seemed to indicate that they had access to the nuclear launch codes, that they were able to somehow access the so-called football, the collection, the briefcases that are filled with these codes that accompany the president but are also kept in other places for use in case of all-out nuclear war. So the perpetrators of 9/11, the coup faction inside the U.S. government, have these codes. They can launch nuclear war that way. There's another way they could have launched it, through an exercise called Global Guardian, because it just so happened that on the morning of 9/11 there was also an exercise simulating all-out thermonuclear war. And part of that exercise appears to have been an attempt, as a part of the drill, as a part of the simulation, for a rogue faction to gain access to command and control systems that would give them the ability to launch missiles. So that might be the concrete, specific backdoor that the invisible government might have used in order to escalate in the nuclear realm if that had become necessary. Essentially, the ultimatum to Bush is, either you launch the war of civilizations against the Arabs and the Islamic world in Afghanistan, later in Iraq, you launch it in conventional form, or we will launch it ourselves in nuclear form.
As Tarpley notes in his seminal work, 9/11 Synthetic Terror, Bush made two very telling stops with Air Force One that morning. The first was to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, an important node in the STRATCOM war exercise known as Global Guardian, which was taking place that day. The second was Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. This just happens to be home to the Strategic Command Bunker, the only place from which the Commander-in-Chief can personally override any nuclear launch command. Also at Offutt Air Force Base that day was Warren Buffett, who was hosting a charity event for presidents, CEOs, and other captains of industry, who on any other given day would have been at their offices, many of them at the World Trade Center. This information comes from Ann Tatlock, CEO of Fiduciary Trust, who on that morning was attending Buffett's event and watched as the second plane crashed into her own office. Why is Bush's stop at the Strategic Command Bunker at Offutt Air Force Base, and the coincidental presence there of Warren Buffett and many of the presidents and CEOs of the businesses destroyed that day, not talked about in the controlled corporate media?